All right, so Matt Ritter. Matt's from Potter Valley, Mendocino County, Northern California. He got his Bachelor's of Science from UC Santa Barbara, his PhD from UC San Diego, and he's currently a professor of biology at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. I first got to know Matt with this book, his California's Guide to the Trees Among Us. And what I realized when I read this book, at first I thought, who wants to know about urban trees? And then I realized, wow, this guy is a great storyteller. I now want to know about urban trees. I've always been a lover of trees of the wilderness, and this really turned me on to a whole new picture about trees in California and beyond. And I think that's the main thing that has impressed me. Among the many facets of Matt's life, he's an amazing storyteller. And he uses plants as a way to foster appreciation and cultivate curiosity for the natural world. And I can really connect with that. And he does it not just for adults, he does it for kids of all ages. His book that came out last year is California Plants. And then his brand new release, which my family, my 1-year-old and my 7-year-old have been thoroughly enjoying, is Something Wonderful. And it's a story that you'll have to dive into at another time. I'm not going to give away all the details, but it's a fabulous kids book. So with all that being said, it's my honor to introduce Matt Ritter.
All right, well, thank you, Michael. Can you hear me okay? You can hear me? All right. And I am going to share my screen then. Michael said, I am in San Luis Obispo. I'm coming to you live from my office here at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, and I'm a member of San Luis Obispo, a proud member of the San Luis Obispo chapter of the California Native Plant Society. And it's an honor to speak to you all, and thank you for coming out or coming to your living room or wherever you are to watch the video and listen to me speak. Happy Earth Day, everyone. And I'll have a few comments about Earth Day as well later on in the talk. And I'm just going to start right here with my title slide and say that this is the upper San Ynez River Valley, which is in Santa Barbara County. I took this picture 2 springs ago. It's off of Highway 154. And this picture represents so much of what California is to me: a clear, sunny day in California's brief green period, which we happen to be in right now in the central coast of California. There's oak woodlands, there's chaparral in the foreground and the background. There's an agricultural interface that's actually an olive orchard that you're seeing there, a riparian area, native and non-native plants. This would be impossible for us to do, but if we could count the number of species in this photo, I'm sure it would be hundreds. So much diversity in such a small area, which is true for a lot of places in California. Hopefully you can see my cursor, and I'm circling right there a valley oak woodland, which is on the deep soiled alluvial plain above the San Ynez River there. This is the valley oak woodland. I love the valley oak. I grew up around valley oaks. It's a majestic tree known for its scaly bark and dark green, deeply lobed leaves. It's also one of the world's largest oak species. This, what you're seeing here in these 2 images, the world champion valley oak, which is outside Covelo in Mendocino County. And James Balog, who's a famous photographer, took composite photos of the world's largest trees. And this is his photograph of that tree in Covelo, California. And I love his photo for this perspective on the tree. He's seeing it from all kinds of different angles, but also if you look closely at the bottom, and I zoomed in here, you can actually see 2 people standing at the base of the tree to give you an idea for how large that tree actually is. It's a massive tree with a huge trunk at the base. And until recently, actually, that was thought to be the valley oak with the largest diameter. It is by far still the largest valley oak with regards to full mass and height and so on. But just recently, Martin Crawford found an even larger diameter valley oak outside Mariposa, California, and there's Martin standing next to that. So these are very, very impressive trees. The valley oaks are endemic to California. And that means that it occurs here in the state, within the boundaries of the state, and nowhere else in the world. They grow from Shasta Lake in north all the way down to the San Fernando Valley in the south. And it was well known to the Spaniards. The Spaniards called them robles. Local town here, Paso Robles, or is what we call it. Paso de los Robles is actually misnamed for this species. And valley oaks dotted the fertile lowlands of California when Europeans first showed up. And Willis Lynn Jepson, California's seminal botanist, he wrote in 1923 that the valley oaks were recognized as the sign of the richest soil. And for this reason, many of them were removed for agriculture during the early 18th century settlements in California. And these trees are massive, many of them. And with 18th or 19th century technology, they were actually very difficult to remove. The Atascadero historical photo in the upper left-hand corner there actually shows valley oak removal with dynamite. And what we see now in many places where the valley oak occurs in California are what we call relic stands, where only remnants of once vast tracts on alluvial fans of California lowland valleys still occur. The valley oak is one of the plants that I think is responsible for my interest in botany. I'm a 7th generation Californian. I grew up in a remnant stand of valley oaks in Potter Valley, California, which is an interior valley in Mendocino County. I graduated from high school with 16 people from a public school, so it was a small town. Potter Valley is at the headwaters of the Russian River. And the arrow here indicates the house where I spent the first 17 years of my life. And there was a heavy snow. Well, at least it was heavy for Potter Valley in the winter of 1985. And it was enough for me and my 3 brothers we went to our neighbor and we borrowed skis from him. And we taped the skis to our shoes and we pretended to be like we were skiing around on the slopes in this 4 inches of slushy snow. But what I'd like you to pay attention to in this photo that I'm showing you here is this oak in the background, which is a massive individual oak that I grew up next to. It was well over 6 feet in diameter. And it grew right next to the barn just outside of our house. And what we didn't know then in 1985 was that it was mostly almost completely rotted on the inside. And in the heavy rains of 1993, that tree fell and destroyed our house. You can see the fallen tree here. There is the canopy of the tree landed on the house, and we weren't home at the time, which was lucky, but it was still raining hard and the roof was caved in and it rained in the house for about a week, destroying everything. And think about this story now, and I think about what I knew about the valley oak at that time, which was essentially nothing. I knew we had the big trees around the house and so on. And I think this might be the way that many Californians think or don't think about the plants around them. They just are these entities in the background. And I think this was an incident of botany coming to me. And as I think it might have come to many of you in different ways at different times in your lives. And I think an event like this got me thinking about large trees and got me wanting to know more about them. And I remember actually learning the name of that tree after this event. Never knew it was called the valley oak until after this event. And since that time, I've had the good fortune of being able to follow my interest in plants and botany. And I've now been teaching students about botany in the California Flora for, well, this is my 18th year at Cal Poly in the biology department. And I teach a course here called Field Botany every spring, where we get, or I should say we used to get, but we get about 40 to 50 students in vans, and we take them throughout California, and we teach them species that make up the wonderful flora of the state. And we go to all the different ecosystems and all the different floristic provinces, which are inaccessible from San Luis Obispo. And a crucial motivation behind my teaching is to help students identify California plants. This is true of all my research work. It's true of the books that Michael talked about, that I'm trying to help people identify things. But why help people identify things? Well, I believe that the name of a plant is the password that gives you access to its whole story. And knowing the names of species and knowing the stories is incredibly important. David Orr says that the average person has come to recognize over 1,000 corporate logos, but can now recognize fewer than 10 plants or animals native to his or her locality. And this is a serious issue, and this has been well documented in several peer-reviewed publications about what now is being called plant blindness, which is basically the inability to even see the organisms that so much of our society and our material wealth and our physical health depend on. And the societal disconnect from the environment, I believe it to be a serious problem. It's a problem that I think organizations like CNPS are addressing. It's a problem that needs to be addressed in schools and in many levels of society. And I think part of it is about telling the stories of organisms. I think telling the stories of plants and familiarizing people with them and giving them a name helps combat the type of apathy that can lead to biodiversity loss. And I recently tried to go through the iconic flora of California, choose what plants to do, and in the book California Plants that was published actually last year, try to explain and talk about some stories of the plants that really define this state and the species that we care about the most. I tell the story in the book of the Valley Oak. It's one of several hundred in the book. So what I thought I'd do with you this evening on our Zoom webinar here is go through some of the iconic California native plants, some of which you might already know and love, some of which you may grow in your gardens or in your backyards, some of which you may consider loving neighbors in your area. But I'll let you know at the beginning here that none of these stories will be as violent as my early run-in with the Valley Oak. I picked a few species in order to bring up some recurring themes that I see in the California flora. And these are the themes I want to talk about are seasonality, rarity, beauty, and grandeur. So seasonality, rarity, beauty, and grandeur. I think these are themes that sort of define the California flora. And before I get into those themes, I want to talk briefly about, in more global terms, about the California flora so we can appreciate how diverse and special it is. California is one of the world's 33 biodiversity hotspots, according to Conservation International. These are regions that harbor a great deal of species diversity that's found nowhere else in the world, while at the same time being significantly impacted by humans. The western portion of California has a Mediterranean climate, and these are areas with mild, wet winters and warm, dry summers. Interestingly, only 2% of the land area in the world has a climate like we have here in Western California. And plants, they don't recognize political boundaries. So the actual Mediterranean climate western portion of California, which is the actual biodiversity hotspot, usually goes by the name the California Floristic Province. It contains a little bit of southeastern Oregon, a little bit of northwestern Baja California, and some area around of Nevada, actually right around Tahoe. And if you look at the number of species in that California Floristic Province, we have 6,000 native species, give or take a couple hundred, in the California Floristic Province. And 42% of those are endemic, meaning they occur nowhere else in the world. It's a high level of endemism for such a large area. It's more than 150,000 square miles, I believe, and that's 42% endemism just over that area. And interesting as well that 3/4 of the original habitat has been lost in California since the first European incursions into the state. And there are 40 million, I think it was in April of 2019 that we ticked over into the population of 40 million people in California. That's 40 million people, and likely 40 more million people on the way. The population of California just keeps going up and up. Half of all the food eaten in the United States is grown here in California. So we have these major agricultural and developmental impacts in this state, and yet it's still one of the most biodiverse places in the temperate world. If we look at the California specifically, and we include just the boundaries of the state, the political boundaries of the state, their total number of native species is just over 5,000. And if you add all the subspecies and varieties and so on, you get up over 6,500 taxa within the boundaries of California. And interestingly, that diversity is not evenly distributed in the state. As a recent paper by Bruce Baldwin and his colleagues at UC Berkeley showed that species richness and endemism in California is unevenly distributed, and these are 10 square kilometer sections of California and the number of species that occur in each of those. And you can see some areas like the Transverse Range, the Peninsula Range, the Sierra Nevada foothills, the interior portion of the North Coast Range, here in San Luis Obispo. These are biodiversity hotspots within a biodiversity hotspot. Our flora is also strange in another way, in that it's got over a third of the California species are in only 5 families, and the largest of which is the sunflower family, the Asteraceae. It's also interesting to look at the whole planet and ponder the question about life history and lifespan of plants that occur in different parts of the planet. At the equator, in tropical rainforests, where the growth period is pretty much year-round, almost 100% of all the plants there are perennial. They live year after year. And this is also true at the higher latitudes, where the growth season is very short, sometimes too short to flower and fruit in a single season. But interestingly, California sits in the sweet spot latitude between the equator and the poles, where the annual life form is advantageous. Annual plants are the plants that complete their life cycle in a single year. According to Peter Raven and Daniel Axelrod's seminal work on the origins of the California flora, nearly a third of the species in California are annuals. Here's the table from that publication, in which they show that the California floristic province has 28.6% annuals. And this is an incredibly high percentage for any of the world's flora. In fact, we have more plants that grow and die in a single season than anywhere else in the world. And what it means is that for a brief period in the spring, right now, in this time of year, in our Mediterranean climate, in many places in California, you get a riot of annual plants. This is the seasonality that defines so much of our flora. I took a photo from the same fence post for 16 consecutive months in 2010 and 2011 of a local peak in San Luis Obispo called Bishop Peak, which shows this incredibly short green period where, for the most part, it's all brown. And notice the evergreen trees, though, are not changing in that time. This short period of annual growth, the seasonality of our flora, gives us the wildflower fields that parts of California are really famous for. And this is a picture that I took in the Antelope Valley last year. Here's a couple shots from the Carrizo Plain from last year. Really had a good bloom year last year, much better than this year. And that was in early April on the Carrizo Plain. Here's spring in the Carrizo Plain can be a spectacular display. Here's gold fields, purple phacelia, and spiny salt bush in the Carrizo Plain. The seasonality in California is exemplified best by vernal pools. And vernal pools are these seasonal wetlands that form in shallow depressions underlain by impervious soils that retain a little bit more of the winter rainfall. And the short wet season in California leads to this special and now rare habitat. Here's a couple photos from the Jepson Prairie Preserve in Solano County. And what happens in these vernal pools is, as the water level subsides, you get different species flowering sequentially and forming rings of color around the pool's margins. these special habitats are really great when you get to see them in full bloom and you get the different rings of color at different times. Here's a vernal pool early in the season in eastern San Luis Obispo County in a place called Red Hill Road. And as these vernal pools dry down, you can find really great plants in them. And they're often small plants. And we've done this and looked at this specific vernal pool many times in this field botany class that we teach. I saw this vernal pool just a couple of weeks ago. This is what field botany looks like in the time of COVID-19, me out there by myself looking at plants. This is what it used to look like, and where we had students, they're all together. Remember when that many people could be that close together? Well, not only do vernal pools exemplify seasonality, but they also exemplify this idea of rarity in the California flora. Agriculture and urban sprawl in California have made vernal pools rarer and rarer. In fact, as much as 90% of the vernal pools present in California in pre-Columbian times are now gone. California's vernal pools are now full of rare plants and animals. California as a state, as it turns out, is full of rare plants. 37% of the species in California are rare, and we have 284 species that are officially state or federally listed as rare and endangered. And two examples that I put there are of Hooveria purpurea, the purple amole, which is a student of ours here at Cal Poly is working on studying out in near that vernal pool that I just showed you in eastern San Luis Obispo County. And then there in the middle is the San Luis Obispo Mariposa lily. It's not all rarity though. Some of our plants are widespread. Some of them are common. Some of them are famously known all over the world. They're known for their beauty as much of our flora is. The California poppy, for instance, is a widespread and resilient plant in the state. It occurs in a lot of different habitats and a lot of different places in California. You probably all know that it's our official state wildflower. What many of you might not know, though, is the California poppy was almost not our official state wildflower. In fact, in 1890, there was an election between these two relatives, the California poppy and the Matilaha poppy, Rhamnea. In that election took place at the California Floral Society to decide which of those two was going to be the official state flower. As it turns out, Matilaha poppy has the largest single flower in our native flora. And the California poppy ended up beating the Matilaha poppy by a landslide victory. John Steinbeck was infatuated with the California poppy. He wrote about poppies and saying of their color that they're a burning color. Not orange, not gold, but if pure gold were liquid and could raise a cream, that golden cream might be like the color of poppies. And there are so many beautiful wildflowers in California, and I'm sure that John Steinbeck didn't see all of them, and he probably didn't see many of them. An example, and one of my favorites, is a plant from the deserts. And this is the habitat where the desert Mariposa lily occurs. This is in Hidden Valley and Joshua Tree. And it was during a trip in 2017 with the field botany class to Joshua Tree that I encountered the desert Mariposa lily for the first time. I had never seen it before, but I knew about it. And I knew that one day I would get to see it. That's one of the great pleasures, by the way, at least for me, of studying the California flora. I haven't seen all the plants. Not by a long shot. I haven't seen all the plants, and there are many that I'm still excited to go out and get a chance to see. This spring, I have seen new plants. And so like every spring is a new awesome time for me to be able to go and see new things. Well, in 2017, it was a really great rain year, and we got out of the vans at Hidden Valley, and there it was everywhere, and it was a real treat. That's the desert Mariposa lily. There were hundreds of them. This is Calochortus kennedyi. Here's one photo that I took there on the sandy flats at Hidden Valley. Here's another photo. It's a deep golden orange cup with purple anthers. It's got nectaries that are lined with these fringed hairs and really satiny, deep orange golden petals. I think of it like the California poppy, just much, much better. And in general, the genus Calochortus is spectacular, and I'll never pass up the opportunity to go see one. I'm particularly proud of the Calochortus page in the California Plants book. There are 67 species of Calochortus, most of which we have here in California, and they're all so different and so spectacular in their own way. Steinbeck he also wrote about the fairy lantern Calochortus, which is Calochortus albus. That's in the upper left-hand corner here. He said that upon finding one, a child would feel special and singled out all day. And that's from East of Eden. And maybe some of you know how that feels. You know, I know I do. So we have these great annual wildflowers in California, all the seasonality, all the rarity and beauty. But as many of you know, California is a special place worldwide for trees. Which brings me to my final theme, grandeur. We have the most massive, the tallest, and the oldest trees. We have the largest oaks, we have the tallest and largest pines, and many, many other champion trees. We have species that occur elsewhere outside California, but they tend to get larger for some reason in California. The bigger the tree, the less justice a photograph does for it. And definitely the less justice a webinar does for it. From left to right here are 3 photographs of the largest single stem trees in the world. On the left there is the General Sherman. In the middle is the President tree, and on the right is the General Grant tree. The giant sequoia, which is what these are some of them grow to be 3,000 years old, and each of these monumental trees, it's fascinating to think that they came from one of many tiny seeds made inside of these woody cones that are a little bit larger than a chicken's egg. And at any given time, a mature giant sequoia will have more than 10,000 cones in its canopy, each averaging somewhere about 100, sometimes up to 100 seeds, maybe a little bit less than that. And so over its long lifetime, that's, if you do the multiplication, that's more than 1 trillion possible offspring, which is fascinating. And it's also fascinating to realize that 1 trillion possible offspring, and some of them potentially don't replace themselves in those thousands of years. Recent evidence shows, this is from Steve Sillett, in a really great paper from Steve Sillett called How Do Tree Structure and Old Age Affect Growth Potential of California Redwoods? They showed in this paper that giant sequoias don't decline in growth rate or reproductive output as they age, which is fascinating. It's not like animals. They just get better and better, and they grow more and more. They don't decline in growth rate or reproductive output as they age. They grow just as fast when they're 2,500 years old as they do when they're 250 years old. 3 of the 4 verified oldest species in the world occur in California. And this is based on Rocky Mountain tree research by Peter Brown and others. This is the bristlecone pine. There's the Fitzroy in Chile that can get over 3,600 years old. Then there's the giant sequoias and western junipers, 3 of those 4 here in California. Here's my friend Tim Forsell in the White Mountains with what we think to be the largest, probably not the oldest, but the largest bristlecone pine. This actually supposedly it's a youngster. It's only about 1,800 years old or so. And I recently received a piece of bristlecone pine wood, and actually, just to prove to you that I actually have it, it's right here. This is a piece of bristlecone pine wood from a dead tree that was studied by dendrochronologists. And this piece that he sent me has more than 300 growth rings across a few inches. And dendrochronologists were actually able to piece together, based on the size of these rings in the dead tree that this came from, and some of the living trees around it, that the tree that this piece of wood came from germinated in 5147 BC. So 7,000 years old. this piece of wood, and it lived for about a little over 1,000 years and died sometime around 4,000 BC. And then that dead snag stood there dead for another 2,000 or so years before it got struck by lightning. And it lived at about 11,000 feet, got struck by lightning, went under the ground, and then the dendrochronologists were able to study it there. And I recently was able to resaw some pieces off of it on the bandsaw, and right now I can smell it. It still smells like pine pitch. It's a really scented wood, and it's a 7,000-year-old piece of wood that still smells like pine pitch, which is fascinating. Another cool thing to think about with these very old bristlecone pines, if you see a tree like this, it's got 2, 3, maybe 4 main leaders on it. And all those branches, some of those branches have been separated from each other for more than 2,000 years. There was a shoot apical meristem early on in that pine's life. Branching events took place. And now you have shoot apical meristems, clumps of stem cells that are growing upward, producing those branches, separated for thousands and thousands of years out in the environment, incurring mutations. And it's interesting to think about how the genomes of those two branches and the cells in those branches have changed over those thousands of years. And people have begun to study that, and I found some interesting results potentially in that the genomes have changed a lot during the 2,000 years of separation on that single plant. There are 5 species in the world capable of growing to a height greater than 300 feet. And we have 4 of them in California. There's the giant sequoia, the Sitka spruce, the Doug fir, and the largest one actually is in Oregon. And then there's the mountain ash eucalyptus, which is Eucalyptus regnans, a species that occurs in Victoria, Australia, and Tasmania. Last year, I got a chance to go to Tasmania. This is the island off the southern end of Australia, to look for with some colleagues to look for the largest and see if we could find larger and taller eucalyptus. But however, 2 weeks before we arrived, the centurion, which is the largest and tallest known eucalyptus, was burned in an ongoing and unprecedented wildfires that took place there in Tasmania. Some of you may remember that in the news. Parts of Tasmania's temperate rainforests, they burned, and they hadn't burned for hundreds of years. In some places even hadn't ever burned before in known history. There was incredible destruction in these once pristine forests and even alpine areas that had never ever burned before. And the centurion tree, it burned in the fire, and that species in Eucalyptus regnans is not fire adapted at all. And the centurion is currently, in the last I heard from somebody who saw it relatively recently, a few months ago, it is still alive in the sense that it's got a couple branches that are alive, but it might not make it. And that's a high profile casualty of our changing climate and extreme fires and drying out in places that don't dry out and don't have fires. Also, interestingly, last year, a new discovery was made in Borneo, and we now know that the second tallest tree species in the world is a yellow Meranti tree, a Shoria, which is in the Dunam Valley a conservation area in Borneo. And this was written about in National Geographic. And it's nice to know that there are still places in the world that are so unexplored that one of the world's tallest organisms can be newly discovered there in 2019. That's awesome. This thing, again, over 300 feet tall. And the current record holder is our official state tree, the coast redwood. The over 380 feet tall, 115 meters. The official state tree of California is the coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens. Is one of my favorite plants of all times. The forests in which they grow, they're unequaled in the world, I think. And I've been in a lot of different forests in the world, and the remaining virgin growth redwood forests are truly spectacular. It's interesting that think about my history with the redwood. I first interacted with this species not as a tree, but in the form of its dead body, its lumber. I grew up next to a wooden boat builder, a wooden sailboat builder, a guy named Bob Cummings, who ran the Secret Harbor Boat Works in Potter Valley, California. And you can still see his trimaran sailing canoes on Big River and in Mendocino and Fort Bragg. And he made these canoes out of fiberglass and clear redwood. And I remember, because Bob taught me woodworking early on, and I worked with Bob. I was Bob's assistant for a while, and I remember picking through stacks of redwood lumber, looking for at the local lumber yard. We would go to Redwood Valley or Ukiah and look for the clearest possible redwood boards we could find. And I was on one end of the stack, and Bob would be on the other, and we'd be throwing boards aside. And the wood that we threw aside at the time, you wouldn't even be able to get now. Clear old redwood is becoming incredibly rare, and now is mostly, if you want to find that, it's found only as reclaimed wood. It's a wonderful material. It's one of the world's, I think, one of the best woods in the world. It never rots. It's easy to work. It stays beautiful, whether it's stained or not. People have known that for many years. And unfortunately, this species has been extremely impacted because of its economic value. Starting in about 1850, there was a bonanza of logging that took place in California, right in the area of the North Coast chapter of CNPS. These huge trees yielded huge amounts of wood, and with the technology available in the 1800s, it was difficult for people to log these massive trees. It was dangerous and brutal work. William Carson started the first large commercial lumber company outside Eureka, the Dobler and Carson Lumber Company, and they logged for over 100 years before becoming Pacific Lumber in 1950. And they invented the steam donkey engine, which was basically a powered steam winch that used to pull logs out of the woods. And on the right there is William Carson. He stands proudly next to a board that is 2 inches thick, 70 inches wide, and 12 feet tall. That's the numbers that you see on top of that board. It says Clear Redwood, Dobler, and Carson, Eureka, California. There's not a single knot in that entire board. And material like that just doesn't exist anymore. And as technology increased and entire infrastructures were set up in Northern California to move large trees from the forests to the lumber mills, then to San Francisco and beyond. In the early 20th century, redwood became so popular, it was used for everything. In the town I grew up in Potter Valley, actually, there's a diversion off of the Eel River that goes through the mountain into Potter Valley, into the Russian River. It's an agricultural diversion, and that tunnel that goes through the mountain is made out of redwood, and that thing is still there, still a functioning water canal running through the mountain. And as more and more trees were felled, even more crazy uses were found for this incredible material. And Jepson actually reflected on the importance of redwood trees in California in his Trees of California book in 1923. I'm going to read you what Jepson wrote here. He said, "The writer of these lines is a Californian. He was rocked by a pioneer mother in a cradle made of redwood. The house in which he lived was largely made of redwood. His clothing, the books of his juvenile library, the saddle of his riding pony were brought in railway cars chiefly made of redwood, running on rails laid on redwood ties, their course controlled by wires strung on redwood poles. He went to school in a redwood schoolhouse, sat at a desk made of redwood, and wore shoes, the leather of which was tanned in redwood vats. Everywhere he touched redwood. Boxes, bins, bats, barns, bridges, bungalows were made of redwood. Posts, porches, piles, pails, pencils, pillars, paving blocks, pipelines, sometimes even policemen in the form of toys were made of redwood." That's an awesome quote from him, and it makes me realize that I need to use more alliteration in my scientific writing. But it goes to show like how much of this material was used for all kinds of different things. And all that logging turned what people thought initially to be an inexhaustible resource into a rarity, and they actually thought it was inexhaustible. I've gone back and I've read a lot of the accounts of the history of logging in Northern California at that time, and you can read a nice summation of it in a wonderful book called Trees in Paradise by Jared Farmer. It's a history of California and told through trees. And the background photo here is the turn of the last century, and the inset photo is in 1959, both from Humboldt County. Virgin Coast redwood forests originally covered about 2 million acres in California, and the native range is in the fog belt area from just the San Luis Obispo Monterey County border in Big Sur all the way north just over the Oregon border along the coastline in that Mediterranean fog belt. And that original 2 million acres of old growth forest shown here in green, these forests were logged down to 120,000 acres of preserved land in just over 120 years. And so maybe you guys are seeing a video of that type of logging. That's over 96% of the old growth forests were logged during the time I'm talking about 150 years or so. And I think, thank goodness somebody was paying attention and saved a few groves. At the turn of the last century, the Save the Redwoods League purchased the first groves for preservation and then lobbied Congress to protect what was left. And I think, and you hear stories like that, and I think, first of all, there are organizations like the California Native Plant Society that are doing similar work today. And what are future humans going to look back on us and this time and say, I can't believe that they thought that was inexhaustible? And you could probably come up with some answers for that. What are we acting like is inexhaustible, which is in fact not? And what can we do to pace ourselves in the use of some of the resources? One of the protected stands is what's called the Rockefeller Forest or the Rockefeller Grove. Here's a picture of my previous graduate student, Natalie Rossington, in that grove. And this grove actually has the distinction of having more above ground biomass than any other stand of trees on Earth. It's also the world's largest remaining contiguous old growth forest of coast redwood. It's a truly impressive place. Many of you have probably been there and seen it. If you haven't, it's a great destination. And no doubt, because 96% of these trees were used up, that we lost some of the most spectacular individuals, some of which could have easily been over 400 feet. Humans are very good at walking into a stand and looking around and going, oh yeah, that one right there, that's the biggest one, that's the one we want. And that happened in California, no doubt. So I started with this photo of the San Ynez River and saying that there could be hundreds and hundreds of species here, and that their identification and their names and their stories are important. And I did to tell the interesting stories and compelling stories about our native plants in California plants so that people could fall in love with them and want to protect them. There are pages in the book about plant identification that help with plant identification, like a native tree identification flowchart, wildflower identification color guides. Each iconic species is treated with beautiful photographs, new range maps that I made, natural history stories, and the stories of the people who interacted with these plants. And all of it appears in the context of the habitats that the species are found in, which I felt was important to do it in that way. And today, as you all know, is the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day. And 2 years before that, in 1968, Edward Abbey published Desert Solitaire, a book that many of you have probably read. And in that book, he writes this, that let men in their madness blast every city on Earth into black rubble and envelope the entire planet in a cloud of lethal gas. The canyons and hills, the springs and rocks will still be here. And after sufficient time, no matter how long, somewhere living things will emerge and join and stand once again, this time perhaps to take a different and better course. And Edward Abbey's take on environmentalism, that humanity is and will always be responsible for the destruction and consumption of the world and all the other species in it, it's a depressing vision. And it's one also that I think potentially hasn't aged so well in recent times. So let me give you another vision. And this one comes from Elizabeth Rush, who she teaches at Brown University in Rhode Island. She has written many great things, and she recently wrote in Orion magazine that paying attention to the more than human world is the beginning of justice. When the decline of a species becomes apparent, so too does the need to do something. Despair at what we see happening all around us is but a waypoint to pass through on the path towards learning to act in extraordinary ways. And this is the environmental vision that I want to put forth on Earth Day, that education about the non-human world is a crucial step towards action and healing. Paying attention to what she calls the more than human world as members of it, as healers, as educators, is what we need to do. And like Michael said, I'm celebrating today with the official release of a new children's book about the interconnected life cycles of organisms in the tropical rainforest. The idea behind this book is to engage children in the concepts of ecology and interconnectedness of the more than human world. It follows the life cycle of a fig tree and all the other organisms that depend on it. My friend and previous student, Niall Gonzalez, did beautiful, beautiful illustrations. And if you're interested in getting one, you can order it from that website, and I will actually, I'll send you out a signed copy. And portions of the proceeds from this book go to support the Monteverde Institute, whose mission is to education about the tropical rainforests. So we have so many incredible native plants here in California. We have incredibly beautiful species, we have rare species, and we have the world's most grand plants. And the California Native Plant Society and the Wildlands Conservancy are doing incredible work. They're doing great work, great conservation work. And some of the proceeds of California Plants actually goes to these two organizations. And so with that, I will say, thank you all for listening. It's an honor to speak to you, to be here. I can't see any of you, but I hope you're out there. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're thriving. I hope you're taking care of each other. And so happy Earth Day.